William Henry Harrison is a president famous not for any legislative victories or foreign policy achievements, but because he died. Just 31 days into office, the hero of Tippecanoe would pass away to pneumonia, making him the first president to die in office, and to this day, the shortest serving president. As a result of this ridiculously short tenure, the Harrison presidency is usually reduced to a footnote in the American story or a quick factoid of presidential history. William Henry Harrison is widely regarded as a nothing president, with his biggest accomplishment being the fact that he died, and we were able to figure out what exactly a vice president did. But was William Henry Harrison that worthless as a president? Was he unable to do anything during his 31-day stay in the White House? FDR, after all, was able to sign 30 executive orders 31 days into his presidency. And more recently, Donald Trump signed a flurry of executive orders on day one of his second term. While presidents were certainly less imperial during the 1840s than ones in the 1930s and today, William Henry Harrison had to have done something, anything, as President of the United States during his 31-day window. But what? Well, welcome to the YouTube channel, The Whig. And today we are going to be taking an in-depth look into the pint-sized presidency of William Henry Harrison to see what exactly he was able to accomplish in 31 days. The victory had been won, but it was pregnant with the possibilities of disaster. Historian Glyndon G. Van Deusen wrote, when talking about William Henry Harrison's earth-shattering victory over Martin Van Buren in the presidential election of 1840. For the previous 12 years, Andrew Jackson and his successor, Martin Van Buren, had ruled the executive branch as Democrats, the party of power. Their chief rivals, the Whigs, had long decried the supposed flagrant abuses of power perpetrated by King Andrew and his cronies. But after the Whigs' crushing defeat in 1836, all hope of stopping the Democratic machine seemed lost. Until now. With William Henry Harrison at their side, the Whigs scored titanic victories, not just in the 1840 presidential election, but in the House and Senate as well, gaining the Whig Party an impressive trifecta. The forces of loco-focoism, a Whig term for Democrats, could no longer stand in the way of the Whigs and their key programs, internal improvements, tariffs, and a revival of the National Bank. Whig Senator Daniel Webster wrote, quote, "Well, my dear sir, I have lived to see a great revolution accomplished," end quote. An Alabama Whig wrote, quote, "I now rejoice in the restoration of our common country to its original prosperity and greatness," end quote. Back in 1837, the economy had collapsed, thanks to, at least according to Whigs, Democrat policies when they killed the National Bank. And due to this current economic hardship, the majority of Americans no longer trusted Democrats. Instead, they chose the Whigs to restore prosperity and lead them out of financial troubles. Hence the recent victories where Harrison won the presidency and Whigs were able to win control of the House and the Senate. However, the Whigs easily recognized that future Whig triumphs depended on how the Whigs were able to fix the current economic slump. Whig Senator John J. Crittenden would correctly write that the president-elect, Harrison, and his Whig allies, quote, "must act. The people expect it and are entitled to expect it. The real danger is in inaction and falling behind and disappointing the high hopes of the people," end quote. Historian Robert V. Remini wrote, quote, "This was the one moment, starting March 4th, 1841, the day Harrison would be inaugurated, when Whigs had the opportunity to legislate their dynamic program into law and demonstrate to the American people the value and importance of their policies." End quote. In other words, all Whig hopes rested on the success of Harrison and the economy, and plans for economic recovery were no doubt at the top of Harrison's agenda as president-elect. Another chief difficulty William Henry Harrison had to face, as well, was choosing his cabinet and dispensing patronage jobs. Whigs had long decried Andrew Jackson's presidential appointments as, according to historian Micheal Holt, quote, "incompetent spoilmen," end quote. And Whigs wanted to show that they hired men of, quote, "talent and ability," end quote. Still, of course, in choosing his cabinet, William Henry Harrison had to consider politics as well as talent, particularly whether he should put friends of Henry Clay or Daniel Webster in his cabinet. Clay and Webster, for those who do not know, were two of the most legendary politicians in American history. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts is widely regarded as one of the greatest orators in history, as well as a man key to the history of the Senate. Whenever you hear the Gettysburg Address, you are literally hearing what historian H.W. Brands termed echoes of Daniel Webster, specifically his second reply to Robert Hayne. Henry Clay, on the other hand, was the literal founder of the Whig Party, three-time major presidential candidate, three-time savior of the Union, major player in American entry into the War of 1812 and the subsequent peace treaty that followed, and a debating genius, typically coming up with long, passionate retorts to his opponents on the spot. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were the de facto leaders of the Whig Party, and both hungrily longed for the presidency. The two Whig senators saw William Henry Harrison as a malleable, empty suit to advance their ultimate goal, believing that if their loyalists want control of the administration's cabinet and patronage, then they could exert the most influence over the newly crowned president-elect and be in a perfect position to run for president in 1844. Micheal Holt writes, "Whigs expected to win the next presidential sweepstakes in 1844, and Harrison's pledge not to seek a second term meant that a new man would reap that reward. Both Clay and Webster, who had been thrust aside for Harrison in 1839, determined as soon as the polls closed in 1840 to be that lucky man. Expecting to manipulate the supposedly malleable figurehead in the White House, they both therefore sought to influence the makeup of the cabinet and the allocation of patronage." The battle between Webster and Clay for influence was one of the key problems faced by Harrison as president-elect and president. Meeting Clay not long after his triumphal victory, William Henry Harrison discussed cabinet picks with the wily Kentucky senator. Harrison's original plan to appease both factions was to make Clay his Secretary of State and Webster Secretary of the Treasury. But in his meeting with old Tippecanoe, Clay actually refused the position, probably so that he could stay in Congress to take credit for Whig legislation and any economic improvements that might occur. Instead of himself as Secretary of State, Clay vehemently argued that Webster should be put in that position. That sounds stupid, one might ask. Why would Clay want his rival to occupy the most senior cabinet position in an administration? Well, firstly, the old coon of Kentucky thought that Webster would make a terrible Secretary of the Treasury, as Webster, quote, had not the requisite qualifications for that office, end quote. Webster could barely handle his own finances, with a great orator owing the Philadelphia National Bank $114,000 in 1840. How could any man such as that even hope to run the nation's finances? Clay astutely reasoned. Additionally, Clay did not want his nemesis to receive any credit for a Whig-induced economic rebound, which might occur if Webster was Secretary of the Treasury. But with Webster safely tucked away in the State Department, Clay could be the only major presidential candidate in 1844 to claim credit for saving the economy. Despite rejecting a job in William Henry Harrison's administration, Henry Clay still hoped he could control the president-elect and induce him to nominate Clay loyalists to important positions. At his meeting with Tippecanoe, Clay pushed for friends like John J. Crittenden to be made Attorney General, John Clayton to be placed as Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Ewing to be made Postmaster General. But according to Clay and Webster biographer Robert Remini, quote, the president-elect did not specify a single individual on whom he decided to confirm appointment, end quote. Remini later writes that, quote, in fact, he, we're talking about Clay in this instant, soon realized that his wisest course was to avoid any involvement in the appointing process, end quote. Contrary to Webster and Clay's opinions, Harrison could not be so easily controlled and was immensely vain. Harrison's pride would never let anyone be in control but himself, and no one, not even the great Henry Clay, could tell the hero of Tippecanoe what to do. After this strained meeting, Harrison went on to ignore almost everything Clay advised, offering Daniel Webster his choice of being Secretary of the Treasury or Secretary of State. But an ecstatic Webster surprisingly chose to become Secretary of State. Why? As Robert Remini writes, quote, the Secretary of the Treasury would play a far more important role in shaping the direction of the Harrison administration than any other officer, end quote. So why didn't Webster take the Secretary of the Treasury? The aforementioned historian Micheal Holt writes that Webster chose the State Department because Webster was, quote, aware that he was doomed to play second fiddle to Clay in the Senate, end quote, and, quote, saw the State Department as a distinctive niche for himself, end quote. Also, Daniel Webster saw the State Department as the best way to influence Harrison. Webster loyalist Nicholas Biddle would write to the future Secretary of State, quote, the impression which I have that the coming administration will be in fact your administration, end quote. Like Clay, Webster would go on to send his own recommendations to Harrison for certain positions. But unlike the domineering Clay, Harrison rather liked Webster and tended to listen to more of his advice than the great compromisers. Harrison would go on to name Francis Granger, a Webster recommendation, to Postmaster General, and followed Webster's advice to place Thomas Ewing as Secretary of the Treasury, instead of Clay's preferred recommendation of Postmaster General. Furious at the news of this slight, Clay would storm to Ewing, saying, quote, the people everywhere have pointed to you as PMG, Postmaster General, and you had better conform to that inclination, end quote. Clay was determined to get the man he wanted for the Secretary of Treasury, Clayton, in a cabinet position. And when Harrison arrived to Washington, D.C. in February 1841, Clay met the president-elect and badgered the war hero to pick Clayton as Secretary of the Navy, which was the lone cabinet position available. Despite being polite to the headstrong Clay, Harrison refused to add Clayton to his cabinet. if for nothing else then probably the fact that Clay told him to. Not long after this stormy interview, Harrison filled his last cabinet seat, allowing the world to see the first Whig presidential cabinet, with Thomas Ewing as Secretary of the Treasury, John Bell as Secretary of War, George Badger as Secretary of the Navy, Francis Granger as Postmaster General, John Crittenden as Attorney General, and of course the legendary Daniel Webster as Secretary of State. Despite Clay's objections over the cabinet, he had many loyalists in its ranks, as Holt notes. Quote, thus, despite Clay's failure to win a place for Clayton, his heated argument with Harrison, and Webster's appointment to the most important post, Clay had done well. The other cabinet members were either his outright supporters or at least personally cordial to him. End quote. While Henry Clay was not the most welcoming of the incoming president upon his arrival to D.C., Harrison was greeted jubilantly by large crowds. A sucker for ancient history, Harrison compared his experience arriving from Ohio to D.C. to that of Cicero returning to Rome. Daniel Webster also greeted the president-elect warmly, and the two soon developed a close relationship, with the prideful Harrison even asking Webster for advice. Clay saw Webster's influence over Harrison growing by the day, and was distraught to hear of Harrison's rumored appointment for Collector of the Port of New York, Edward Curtis. Curtis was a Whig enemy of Clay who actively worked to get Clay to lose the 1840 Whig presidential nomination. And as a senator of New York, William Marcy, put it, Curtis, quote, is Mr. W's factotum, which essentially means Mr. Webster's employee. Clay could not take this latest insult, and once again approached Harrison over his appointments. But Tippecanoe responded sternly, quote, Mr. Clay, you forget that I am president, end quote. Quote, Webster has prevailed, end quote, Marcy would write, and indeed, this latest brush boded ill for Clay in his fight for influence over Harrison. At this time, another famous senator was also quite annoyed with the president-elect, though he came from a different party and immensely different principles than Clay, and that was John C. Calhoun. Calhoun biographer Robert Elder writes that the fiery South Carolinian senator was, quote, not impressed, end quote, with Tippecanoe and hated how, as Calhoun put it, how Harrison talked, quote, as if we were old cronies, end quote. Calhoun also hated how Harrison seemed to, quote, enjoy his elevation as a mere affair for personal vanity, end quote. As Inauguration Day creeped on, Harrison struggled with workshopping his inaugural address. The original draft Tippecanoe wrote was an anathema to Daniel Webster, who, according to Remini, was, quote, appalled, end quote, by what he read. A more inappropriate address he could not imagine. Harrison had written mostly about the ancient world, especially the history of Rome. The document repeated the word proconsul so many times that Webster lost count, and the address went on interminably. It was to set a record for length, a record not equaled for most of the 19th century and all of the 20th. As it stood, reported Webster, it had no more to do with the United States than a chapter in the Quran. Apparently, Harrison was trying to prove to the American people that he had a classical education. On Inauguration Day, there was a great celebration across D.C. The Washington Post claims that William Henry Harrison, quote, invented, end quote, the inaugural parade, as floats of log cabins, militias, and 1812 war veterans all beckoned the ascendancy of William Henry Harrison as he rode to the Capitol on a white steed. After his official swearing-in, Harrison then launched into his oft-ridiculed inaugural address. The speech took more than an hour and a half to read and ranks as the longest inaugural address in American history. People often make fun of it for being boring and overly long, but in my opinion, William Henry Harrison's inaugural address was amazing. In the description below, I'll put in a link to an audio version of William Henry Harrison's inaugural address. Gosh, that was a mouthful. And I highly recommend you listen to it. In true 19th century fashion, the speech is very wordy, but I personally loved it. And more importantly for this video, it is the key to understanding what exactly a full Harrison presidency would have looked like. After going through some initial pleasantries, the first major topic William Henry Harrison touches on in his speech is of limiting executive power. The Whig Party was literally founded on the fact that Andrew Jackson was abusing his presidential office, and all Whigs fervently believed that Congress, not the president, should have supremacy in government. In keeping with this Whiggish principle, Harrison vowed to serve only one term. Harrison saw the possibility of serving a second term as a dangerous precedent that created in the executive branch a, quote, love of power, end quote. So to set things straight, Harrison refused to serve any more than his 4-year term provided. Continuing on this topic of limiting the power of the executive branch, William Henry Harrison vowed to use the veto sparingly. Quote, I consider the veto power, therefore, given by the Constitution to the executive of the United States solely as a conservative power, to be used only first to protect the Constitution from violation, secondly, the people, effects of hasty legislation where their will has been probably disregarded or not well understood, and thirdly, to prevent the effects of combinations violative of the rights of minorities, end quote. Harrison also talked of the dangers of executive power over the Treasury, the need for harmony between the federal government and state governments, and the dangers of the nation becoming overly partisan. Closer to the end, the president also touched on his foreign policy vision. He did not delve into too much detail on the subject, but he did say, quote, I assure them, therefore, that it is my intention to use every means in my power to preserve the friendly intercourse which now so happily subsists with every nation, end quote. However, he did promise not to hurt national honor as he pursued these positive relations. On Indian relations, Harrison, arch nemesis of Tecumseh, vowed to treat Native Americans with, quote, liberality and justice, end quote. Whigs despised Jackson's course during the Trail of Tears, and Harrison vowed to instead follow the example of Jefferson and Madison on these subjects. Finally, Harrison expressed his faith in God and concluded the address, quote, I now take affectionate leave of you. You will bear with you to your homes the remembrance of the pledge I have this day given to discharge all duties of my exalted station according to the best of my ability, and I shall enter upon their performance with entire confidence in the support of a just and generous people, end quote. ABC ranks the speech as one of the worst inaugural addresses in history, but I loved it, though this might be partially due to the fact that I love Jacksonian-era politics. But most certainly, Tippecanoe's audience probably hated it, because they had to sit or stand there for an hour and 45 minutes in freezing temperatures to listen to a scholarly speech on the need to limit executive power. None felt the immense cold, however, more than Harrison. The 68-year-old president stupidly decided not to wear a coat when he gave his inaugural address in the freezing weather. And while, quote, wet and shivering, end quote, Harrison then proceeded to greet his guests. Harrison stubbornly claimed that he had experienced worse, but now that he was older, the extreme cold weakened Tippecanoe's immune system and made him susceptible to sicknesses he might not be able to recover from in his advanced age. All right, now that Harrison was president, what were the top issues he had to deal with? Well, first, his cabinet picks had to be approved, with his most important pick, Webster, receiving a unanimous vote in the Senate. Starting work the next day, Webster turned out to be a brilliant pick for Secretary of State, with the order being a good negotiator and a diligent worker, as he usually worked 12 hours a day. Almost immediately after Harrison was sworn in, Webster's immense powers were put to the test in Tippecanoe's first major crisis, and one that threatened America with war. In the preceding months and years, particularly during the presidency of Martin Van Buren, tensions between Great Britain and America had reached a fever pitch. Both countries disputed with each other over who owned a piece of territory called New Brunswick in northern Maine, and this resulted in an international incident known as the Aroostook, probably pronounced that wrong, War. There were no casualties in this so-called war, but British and American militias were both sent to the area in a fierce standoff. Troops were withdrawn in 1839, but the threat of war never faltered over the disputed land, especially as a separate incident added flames to the fire. In 1837, an American ship, the Caroline, was seized by the British for supplying Canadian rebels, resulting in the death of one American. Later, a British supposed perpetrator in the plot, Alexander Micheal, probably pronounced it wrong, visited New York, where he stupidly bragged that he was involved in the seizure of the Caroline. To the United States, a role in the capture of the Caroline was a criminal act, and Micheal was soon imprisoned and indicted for murder and arson, acts likely to receive the death penalty. Britain demanded that Alexander be returned due to the fact that he was simply acting on orders from the government in the Caroline affair, but America wouldn't budge. Robert Remini writes that Americans were, quote, incensed by British arrogance and brutal disregard of U.S. sovereignty, end quote, while Britain's, quote, determined to teach upstart Yankees a lesson, commanded that Micheal be rescued or revenged, end quote. The American minister in London stated that there was, quote, a general impression that war is inevitable, end quote, and the Duke of Wellington believed it was, according to Remini, quote, likely, end quote. Van Buren refused to touch the issue as a lame duck president, and so it was now up to Tippecanoe and Daniel Webster to solve the growing problem. The British saw Daniel Webster as an Anglophile. After all, Webster fervently opposed American entry into the War of 1812, so they proved to be more open in negotiations with Webster than with preceding Secretary of States. Skillfully, Webster cooled tensions, but in order to solve the issue, Micheal needed to be released. But the governor of New York at this time, William Seward, you might remember him as Abraham Lincoln's future Secretary of State and the man who purchased Alaska, refused to let Micheal go for fear of a political outcry against him. Harrison sent his Attorney General Crittenden to persuade Seward, but the governor remained intractable. Webster would ultimately avert war and solve the New Brunswick's dispute, but unfortunately, Harrison died before the complete solution to the crisis came together. As for MacLeod, he was taken to trial on October 4th, 1841, but the jury found that MacLeod had probably lied about his participation in taking the Caroline and was found not guilty. Hugh. Among Harrison's other major problems as president was dispensing patronage jobs. Hordes of ravenous office seekers beseeched the president to hire them for such and such job. Harrison got sick of it and ordered Webster to release a circular essentially stating that jobs would be awarded off merit and not political aid, and that patronage should not be used to advance political interests. Despite his close relationship with Webster, at one point Harrison even rebuked the Secretary of State for trying to intervene in a political appointment. Writing on a piece of paper, Harrison forced Webster to read out loud, quote, "William Henry Harrison, President of the United States," end quote. As all these patronage and foreign policy problems unfolded, Henry Clay was not making Harrison's life any easier. Concerned heavily with the state of the economy, Clay demanded that Harrison open a special session of Congress so that he could pass Whig policies and put them on the president's desk. Clay genuinely wanted to help the administration, writing, quote, "We must support this administration, or rather, I should say, we must not fall out with it," end quote. But Clay had to be the one in control at all times, and Harrison's quickly bruised ego was insulted by Clay's obstinance. In a letter on March 13th, Clay badgered Harrison to call a special session, even writing Harrison's proclamation to call it for him. But furiously, Tippecanoe refused. In an angry response to Clay, the president wrote, quote, "You use the privilege of a friend to lecture me, and I take the same liberty with you. You are too impetuous. Much as I rely upon your judgment, there are others whom I must consult, and in many cases to determine adversely to your suggestions," end quote. Remini writes that, quote, "It is quite possible that Harrison had every intention of calling a special session eventually, but not at Clay's discretion." This stubborn decision to not call a special session to spite Clay soon changed, however, after Harrison received a report from his Secretary of the Treasury that the country veered towards financial insolvency. The session was then speedily called, but Harrison would soon get desperately sick and would die on April 4th, 1841. His last words were, quote, "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." With Harrison gone, a certain John Tyler, Harrison's vice president, would ascend to the White House. Everyone believed that Tyler was a Clay loyalist. In fact, the whole reason he was picked for VP was to appease Clayite Whigs. So it looked like the tides had reversed with Webster and Clay, with Clay now controlling the most influence over the president. But, to be honest, few knew Tyler's true political intentions. Surely, though, he would remain a steadfast supporter of Whig principles. Right? Right? Well, everyone, that is the end of the video for today. Sorry if it was a little overly long. I intended this to be kind of short, but, yeah, that clearly didn't happen. But anyways, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video on William Henry Harrison. I did quite a bit of research on this one, but if there was any factual inaccuracies or whatever that I said in here, please make sure to say that in the comment section below. If you want to listen to William Henry Harrison's inaugural address, again, That's in the description below. And hopefully I'm going to put in some of my sources in there as well. But anyways, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I put a lot of work into this one, but I hope you enjoyed. Thank you guys so much for watching, and God bless you.